Welcome to this training video, which supports the delivery of the Year 10 Courts of Sorts unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of 5 lessons which build upon citizenship units from years 7, 8 and 9. There are 2 areas of focus within the unit. The first 2 lessons look at the ways in which citizens may be involved in the legal system and the processes through which judges in England make sentencing decisions. The second area of focus is how countries work together on the global stage in the form of intergovernmental organisations. The lessons will cover the aims and the work of the Commonwealth and the United Nations, and the role of the UK within each of the 2 groups. Between these 2 areas of focus is a lesson which acts almost like a bridging topic. It's about international laws, specifically focusing on international humanitarian law, which is also known as the rules of war. The sequencing of these lessons means that pupils start by looking at courts at a national level, before considering how laws and courts may operate at an international level, and then learning about these international organisations afterwards. If you had additional time within this unit, you could also extend it by including further lessons about NATO or the European Union, and continuing to draw comparisons between these multinational groups. The first lesson begins with a Do Now activity, which encourages pupils to recall key information about courts. Ideally, you would give pupils 2 or 3 minutes to list a word starting with each letter of the alphabet which somehow relates to this image. They may, for example, come up with words such as court, judge, lawyer, or witness. One way of encouraging all pupils to contribute at the beginning of this lesson is to ask them to each provide an answer for an assigned letter as you take the register. For example, the first pupil responds with a word starting with A, the next with B, and so on. If a pupil doesn't have an answer for that letter, you could ask the wider class for suggestions, and where possible, try to circle back to those pupils who weren't able to provide an answer to include everyone as much as is possible. Pupils are then asked to recall the specific individuals who may be present within a courtroom and to differentiate between those who are there for their job and those who are there for other reasons. You could then show this slide and the one for the Crown Court and ask pupils to identify each of the labelled individuals. The slides are animated so that each of the answers will appear in alphabetical order by the label as you click through the slide. The lesson then focuses on the role of the magistrate. There's information within the slide deck about what the role involves, but this could also be supplemented by reading through the magistrate's job profile handout. This handout is slightly different to other job profiles in that some of the information isn't included, because a subsequent classroom discussion will focus on the characteristics that pupils would expect to see within a magistrate. Encourage pupils to consider whether or not they might be interested in being a magistrate when they're older, and their reasons. That then leads into pupils completing the first row of this worksheet. Based on what they've understood from the lesson, pupils should create a list of reasons for and against the use of legally untrained magistrates. You may decide to provide pupils with copies of the magistrate's arguments handout to help them with this task. The handout features 15 different statements which pupils would then need to classify as being benefits or disadvantages. Encourage pupils to write more than just 1 or 2 words for each idea. They should be able to develop explanations to clarify why something is positive or negative. Pupils then have an activity where they'll be divided into small groups to take on the role of a jury. Obviously, they can't watch a full trial, so instead they can read through the notes written by this fictitious juror and deliberate before coming to a verdict. Different groups may approach this in different ways, which could also then mimic the approaches of different juries. Discuss those approaches as a class before sharing the verdict from each jury, and then share the information from the teacher notes to explore what's likely to have happened if this was a real court case. There's further discussion prompts included in the teacher notes to use if time allows. The final part of the lesson is involving pupils coming to a final decision as to whether or not they believe that magistrates and juries should continue to be used. Pupils need to consider all the arguments that they've listed on their worksheet and then write a reasoned argument. They might recommend continuing with the current model, or abolishing both magistrates and juries, or keeping one and binning the other. You could then take a class poll to determine the overall sentiment of the class. Lesson 2 starts with pupils being asked to list different punishments which may be given to someone who's found guilty of an offence. Later in the lesson, pupils are asked to recommend sentences for individuals found guilty of these 3 offences. At this point, you might want to discuss pupils' suggestions and their justifications, but don't yet tell them what the likely sentences might be. Instead, explain that sentences are determined by a range of factors and that you're going to explore those as a class before coming back to the specific sentences for these 3 offences. Content then explores why we seek to punish people, the aggravating and mitigating factors which can increase or decrease a sentence, and discussions about the ways in which magistrates and judges use sentencing guidelines for consistency across the country. It's at this point that you might then want to come back to these 3 offences and discuss those potential punishments. That then leads into a practical activity whereby pupils take on the role of a magistrate. They will use the simplified burglary sentencing guidelines to determine the levels of harm and culpability within 3 different scenarios, which will then help them to identify the category of the specific offence. Pupils will need to identify the relevant aggravating and mitigating factors which might affect the judgment before deciding on an appropriate sentence and providing a justification. One of the handouts which is provided with the scenarios also features a range of different punishments which could be helpful for pupils to use to prevent them from going to wild extremes or giving very, very minimal punishments. Lesson 3 focuses on international laws with a specific exploration of international humanitarian law. This slide is used to introduce the idea of conflict, and pupils are asked to identify what each of the plots on the map might represent. This image comes from an American organisation called the Council on Foreign Relations, and each marker reflects an example of conflict which is deemed to be of significance. The Council on Foreign Relations website does seem to suggest that the impact on the United States is a large factor in what is featured, which is also a nice link back to pupils' previous work on news values and proximity and significance within their media literacy unit from Year 9. After defining the word war, pupils learn about the origins of the international humanitarian law, which can be informally referred to as the rules of war. Whilst watching a video from the International Committee of the Red Cross, pupils are asked to make notes about the key elements of IHL, using the images on their worksheets as prompts. Pupils then have an opportunity to demonstrate their understanding of IHL through a continuum task, where they need to move to opposite sides of the classroom to indicate whether they think the actions listed are legal or illegal. Information is included within the file to explain the circumstances in which these actions may be permitted or may be seen to violate the law. If time allows, an additional activity from the British Red Cross is included within the lesson resources, which asks pupils to take on the role of a military commander and to determine which specific scenarios they would be willing to authorise. The final part of this lesson explores what the potential consequences of violating international laws, such as IHL, might be. The final 2 lessons of the unit focus on the UK's role within 2 intergovernmental organisations, the Commonwealth and the United Nations. Before we focus on the activities within this lesson, which is about the Commonwealth, it's important to highlight that the structure of the Commonwealth means that the UK plays no more significant a role than any other member state. Even though the learning question is about what the UK's role is, the potentially underwhelming answer is that it doesn't really have a major part to play in the modern guise of the Commonwealth. The worksheet shown here is used to encourage pupils to identify countries which are member states of the Commonwealth. The first letter of each country has been supplied, and pupils need to then identify each country. The slide deck shows a map of all of the countries in the Commonwealth as well, which hopefully will then trigger discussion about the reasons behind the geographic distribution of those member states. Pupils may be able to make connections between the Commonwealth and the former British Empire, and therefore recognise that most of the member states were once ruled by the British Empire. In recent years, however, some additional countries have decided to join the Commonwealth, seeking to build relationships with existing member states, which may lead to trade deals or other benefits. Pupils will then read this information handout and identify key details to summarise on the worksheet. This worksheet will also be used in the subsequent lesson about the United Nations, which will allow comparisons to be made between the 2 organisations. The Commonwealth and the UN both involve situations whereby all countries are seen as equal, regardless of size, wealth or power. As I mentioned earlier, despite the Commonwealth having origins in the British Empire, the UK has no special privileges or powers. It's also worth noting that this is potentially also a point of difference to the UN. Although the UN General Assembly is the body in which all member states are treated equal, the situation is very different in the UN Security Council, as will become clear in the next lesson. Pupils then have an opportunity to experience the idea of agreement by consensus, whereby they are allocated the role of a trade minister for a country and must try to persuade other countries to make a deal. The fly in the ointment, however, is that each country's wish list conflicts with another country's non-negotiables, and therefore it will be nearly impossible to please all parties involved. This task from the Royal Commonwealth Society helps pupils to better understand that the nature of agreement by consensus across the Commonwealth is potentially a significant problem, and if pupils found it hard to agree between 4 countries, imagine how difficult it would be between 56 countries. The final lesson of the unit focuses on the United Nations and the role of the UK within it. Pupils are asked to divide a post-it note into 3 areas, and pupils then write down what they know and think they know about this stimulus image, as well as a question that they have. You then ask pupils to suggest their ideas in pairs before discussing them as a class. This sculpture is formally known as non-violence, but it's commonly referred to as the knotted gun. It sits outside the entrance to the United Nations headquarters in New York City. You might then want to ask pupils to consider the significance of the sculpture and the messaging that they think the sculptor is trying to convey. Throughout the lesson, pupils will add to the second column of their worksheet, which they started in the previous lesson about the Commonwealth. The lesson outlines the 2 main decision-making bodies of the UN, which are the General Assembly and the Security Council. I mentioned earlier about how the makeup of the UN Security Council is significantly different to the equal footing on which member states are given within the Commonwealth and the UN General Assembly. The 5 countries shown in the dark blue section of the table here, China, the UK, the USA, France and Russia, all have permanent seats within the Security Council, whereas every other member state who wants to join the Council must seek to be elected for a 2-year term. You can also see from the current non-permanent members that there are geographical requirements in terms of how the Council is compromised, which ensures that there is balance and fair representation. This is different to the General Assembly, which involves all member states, and they each receive 1 vote regardless of size or power. However, there is further inequality in the structure of the Security Council because of limitations on how decisions are made. This is particularly important because Security Council decisions are legally binding, whereas the decisions made in the General Assembly are mainly just indicative. For a proposal to pass within the Security Council, at least 9 of the 15 members must approve it. However, the 5 permanent members have the power to veto a proposal by voting against it, even if that's just 1 of the 5. This means that the permanent 5 have considerably more power over and above the other council members. Pupils are asked to consider the fairness of such a system, particularly given the stark contrast to how the Commonwealth makes their decisions. Pupils then work in pairs or small groups to summarise and present the work of different agencies and bodies which carry out aspects of the UN's work. Pupils should read the information handouts and create a summary of between 30 seconds and a minute, which they will then share with the rest of the class. That then leads into the final main task of the lesson, which involves pupils ranking the agencies and bodies in order of their perceived value or usefulness. In the example here, this pupil has suggested that they think the most essential of the 9 agencies is the World Health Organization, and that UNESCO isn't that important compared to the others. As mentioned in other training videos, the initial ranking within the Diamond 9 itself isn't so much the focus here, because it's very easy for pupils to simply write down a few keywords in a box without really thinking much at all, let alone thinking hard about where they're ranking each organisation. Instead, by asking pupils to add justifications for their top and bottom selections, as is done here, we're encouraging pupils to really think about the reasons behind their decisions. The justifications don't need to be long, but the benefit is that it not only nudges pupils into thinking in greater depth, but it also prepares them for the subsequent discussion when you seek to compare responses. As I've also mentioned during other training videos, it's useful to seek feedback from pupils so they can get a sense of how others have responded. An easy way to do this is to read each of the 9 responses and to ask pupils to raise their hands if they ranked it in their top 3, and to write those on the whiteboard in one colour, and then to do it again for the bottom 3. This can then open up discussion about the reasons for placement, and you can focus on examples with a clear difference in responses. In this case, pupils tend to believe overall that the work of the DPO in maintaining security and operating peacekeeping missions isn't that important, and so you could ask questions about why that perception may exist. The very last section of the lesson specifically focuses on the role of the UK within areas of the UN beyond the Security Council and the overall strengths and weaknesses of the UN. This should support pupils in completing the second column of their worksheet, along with the rest of the content from the lesson. If you'd like further information about the content that is covered within this unit, these organisations all have a wealth of resources. ACT, or the Association for Citizenship Teaching, is a subject association for citizenship, and members have access to a wide range of lesson resources and online training, including content on the legal system and intergovernmental organisations. The lesson on international humanitarian law featured a number of activities from the British Red Cross, but their website has further information and resources which could be used to extend that content. These include topical news stories which relate to behaviour during conflict, advice about how to discuss conflict with children and young people, and an interactive film called If War Comes to You. The Sentencing Council is a public body which sits under the Ministry of Justice, but which acts independently. Their role is to create the sentencing guidelines which courts follow to maintain consistency. Their website includes the guidelines for magistrates and Crown Courts, which can be easily searched to find examples of offences beyond those considered within the lessons of this unit. Their website also includes an area of teacher resources, including information about the National Mock Trial Competition and an interactive website called You Be the Judge, which has recently been updated to support pupils' understanding of the sentencing process. And finally, United Nations Association UK is an independent charity which aims to promote the key principles and work of the United Nations. The website includes a collection of resources about the UN, which can be used by teachers and pupils, and includes a UN teaching pack, fact sheets about various UN International Awareness Days, a portal to support the creation and operation of model UN programs within schools, and more detailed information about the UN-UK relationship.